Hello and welcome to another episode of Chai, Children of Adam and Eve on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan of Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue during the month of Ramadan, where we discuss research relevant to our lives today. Phoebe Musandu teaches history in Georgetown University. We have invited her today because of her unique approach to history as a discipline, especially African history. We hope non-European historians will pay close attention to her practice and apply this in their own domains as well. We are indeed very grateful for your time, Professor Phoebe, for coming to the studio today to speak to us.
Thank you.
First of all, before we get into the more technical questions about your research, we would like to know a rather negative question, which is, what is Africa not? For those who are non-Africanists, how should they not approach African studies and African history?
Well, I think Africa is it's a big continent, as people are oft to say these days. It's complex, very diverse, and because of this diversity, every component is unique and should be approached as such. And I think in the academy we are more or less aware of this, but sometimes in popular culture, in media, that component is missing. So that would be the main thing.
So that would be the major lesson to learn from writing African history. Would you say that to not assume anything general about Africa before one approaches African studies?
I would say, studying Africa is like studying any other continent. Sometimes there are areas of commonality and sometimes there are areas of divergence. So it's just a continent like any other. And I think in the academy, the way things are structured these days, you have your Europeanists and, your Americanists, and you have your Africanists. In training for African history, at least in the US, people tend to pick a region. So my region is East Africa, even though you are trained to at least teach on the entire continent, you have an area of specialization. So somebody may be a South Africanist or an East Africanist, and then within that region you may have a country and a particular topic that you specialize in, and this becomes the area of your training and your research as a graduate student, and eventually then your career takes its course once you leave the school. So in that respect, it's very much as what it is in other histories.
But would you agree with the perception that in the academy even there has been to write of Africa and African history in one flow, as it were, as if it is one thing to write about, and it is possible to encapsulate African history by the lens of slavery, or African history by the lens of violence, which I guess Akhil Membe has done a great job of debunking some of those myths around African studies and African history.
Well, there are so many trends, I would say, as far as the historiography is concerned. Certainly when you think about something like slavery, it's a big thing for universities in the West. US, understandably, will have a vested interest in studying Atlantic slavery and Atlantic history in general. The interesting thing is, this part of the world, of course, there was a slave trade too, a much older one, and it was a much older world. By the time the Americas were being discovered by Europeans in the 15th century, the Indian Ocean world had been an active, vibrant highway, linking as far as East Asia, the Persian Gulf, and the East African coastline, lots of islands. So that sort of imbalance in the historiography, say, for example, of the Indian Ocean world as opposed to the Atlantic world, is more a reflection of the interests, intellectual, political, economic, of Western the Western academy, if I can put it that way. And then there are other things that, for example, when you think of the study of identity or ethnicity, there are lots of questions, for example, about who are Africans. Are people bound by their ethnic groups, or what used to be referred to as tribes? Some people still refer to them as tribes, or are they complex societies that morph and change over time like others? And in the 1920s, you have anthropologists, structural functional approach to anthropology that puts Africans in these very rigid ethnic categories, and then that gets to be questioned as I would say normal contours for the production of knowledge as you get in past the mid-20th century, and a more sophisticated image of who Africans are and socioculturally emerges. So there are different trends like that, sometimes in topic areas, sometimes in perception of issues such as identity, and just the very fact that we are studying African history, I think is something. In the US, African history as a discipline was initially the practice of African Americans. A few African Americans who, by virtue of their heritage, were curious enough, and they had journals, a few journals that were publishing papers for for scholars researching various aspects of African history. And then eventually it really takes off in the 60s when it goes mainstream into the larger research universities, and that was a big step where people were now recognizing that there's something here, there's something that can be studied. But even then, there was a question of how do we study it? How do you study the history of a continent, large swathes of which were occupied by people who did not have a script? What does it mean to have a source? What is evidence in a continent where many people, not all obviously, don't have script? And these were questions that were addressed continuously, but particularly more intensively after the mid 21st century. So from the 1950s onwards, I had said 20th century earlier. So from the 1950s onwards in the UK and in the US, and eventually African history becomes a more mainstream discipline within the academy.
If you're saying that the pre-European colonial period, if we can call that period, the some would call it pre-modern, but that's problematic sometimes. But the pre-European colonial period, would you say that Africa can be studied outside the African boundaries of the continent the way we understand them today as well? Because Africans were traveling or were slaves in all the way from throughout this region that we're in, as well as what is now considered India as well.
Cities.
So is it possible to study a history of Africa outside the boundary of the continent of Africa?
Oh, certainly. You bring up the cities, for example, or Habeshas, I think is the other name, and there's a lot of interesting research that has been done on, as part of the, broadly speaking, Indian Ocean World Studies on the African diaspora. Previously, I think if you said African diaspora, people would think of, Africans in the Americas or the Caribbean, and they would forget the African diaspora in Qatar or, the Persian Gulf or, the Asian subcontinent.
Yes.
So there is, as part of diaspora studies, we have certainly seen an increase in research in the diaspora in the East. I feel that the ones in the West, at least especially as they pertain to North America, have been, pretty intensively researched. Not that that's complete. You can never complete. Of course, the production of knowledge always goes on. So
coming to specifically to your interests, which are in, I believe, in newspaper production in the colonial period, in the European colonial period. So how do you see the newspaper production Do you see it as an anti-colonial activity? Do you see it as encouraging dissent, or simply as a modernizing societal consensus building activity?
Well, first, quick, that is my main research project for the moment, but I'm also quite interested in women and gender history. But I would say it really depends on who you're looking at. My research looked at the newspaper sector amongst Asians, Europeans, and then those we considered Africans. The ratio, but it's very you could discuss the whole racial categorization, because today, we will call them all Africans. Kenyan Asians or Kenyan Europeans are all Kenyans, for example. And it meant different things to different people. The first newspaper, for example, was co-founded by a woman called Olive Gray, and she actually is the only female editor for much of the 20th century for any newspaper, colonial or post-colonial.
Yeah. In East Africa, or in the whole of Africa?
What was Kenya was initially called the East African Protectorate, and the boundaries shifted here and there. And so in what was then the East African Protectorate, and I would argue for much of East Africa as well. And so Olive Gray started a newspaper called the East Africa and Uganda Mail. And her publication, she's a great supporter of the British Empire and its imperial goals and so on. But she was very disappointed with the local administration. And by the time she was starting the newspaper in the late 1890s, the authorities knew about her quite well, more than they probably would have preferred, because she had been very vocal about her problems with the administration. And so when she starts the newspaper, they actually try to frustrate her in many different ways. For example, by delaying the importation of the print press that she wanted to use for her newspaper, and that sort of thing. So for her, when she starts the newspaper, part of it is she uses the newspaper to then continue complaining about the administration, but she also uses it to try and engineer the sort of society where she feels that migrants like her can flourish. She had many problems, class problems, for example. And then she also happens to have been married to what was then referred to a black man. Actually, he wasn't black in the way we understand black today, but he was a Eurasian. And then that added another layer to her socio-cultural challenges in the protectorate. So she would use the newspaper to advocate for a more even society, and for a society where people of all walks of life could succeed in enterprise, whether or not they were from privileged classes in Europe or they were from people with more modest backgrounds like Olive Gray and her husband. And then you have, to give an example from another sector, Asians. Lots of newspapers established by different Asians. One of the oldest is by a man called Mani Desai, who was one of the founders of the East African Indian National Congress, which was modeled on the Congress of India. And his publication was, for political protest. It was actually a political organ of the East African Indian National Congress. But later on, especially in the 1920s, you start to see people who are frustrated in business or who have made headway in business, who want to use the newspapers to help them get into other sectors of the economy, or to try and level the playing field so that they can enjoy the privileges as far as commerce is concerned that Europeans are enjoying. And I'm thinking of people like J.B. Pandya, who started the Kenya Daily Mail, which actually reigned for the longest span of time from the 1920s to the 1960s. And for Africans, one of the most famous is a newspaper called Moigwithania. When I was in school, in primary school, we would be taught about Moigwithania, and they would tell us, Moigwithania, is to reconcile people. But it's only much later, when I was in university, that I learned the full title of the newspaper. The full title of the newspaper is Moigwithania wa Andu na Borore wa Gikoyo, and that last is, you reconcile of the people and the voice of the of the Kikuyu, which is one ethnic group out of many ethnic groups. And, that's not some it's not a crafty decision that anyone was making. It's simply people who are speakers of a certain language writing in the language in which they felt comfortable. And surprisingly, the newspaper wasn't. When I thought it would be a newspaper that would be railing against the British page after page, but what I found was actually a newspaper that was about the ambitions of what we would call maybe the petty bourgeois amongst the Kikuyu, the young upcoming mission educated male, Kikuyu male, who wants their piece of the pie in the colony. The British are here, and while they have a lot of problems with the administration, they have a lot of respect for advances in science and so on. And they were questioning, how can we take our place in this world? And so they use the newspaper to exchange ideas about enterprise. If you're starting this sort of business, what do you need? What sort of education are our children getting? How can we make sure that we have an education that graduates Kikuyu lawyers and doctors and teachers and that sort of thing, instead of an education system that graduates paper pushers and has us in a chronic subordinate position to Europeans. And so a lot of the newspaper is just about, let's get moving, exchange ideas, let's be innovative. And that's so sometimes, surprisingly, a lot of the newspapers aren't about complaints against the authority as such. Yeah.
But isn't this a type of, if you will allow the term, nationalist sentiment still expressed there, of a community of people who see themselves as part of a community, to hold one's own, to be able to find work, employment, or to as it were be proud of one's heritage or one's position in relation to another group of people who are not from that place?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's certainly a very strong sentiment of, especially for Moiguidani in its earlier years, of how do we get a place at the table and how do we do it for ourselves? There's that very strong sentiment. Later on, you'll have newspapers where people are more disillusioned with the whole self-reliant bootstraps kind of ideology. So there's that element. But I would be careful about whether or not they see themselves as part of a nation. Just by the fact that you're publishing in Kikuyu limits the number of people outside of that ethnic group who can read in that language. And I don't want to blame anybody for doing it. Basically, you start a newspaper and you're thinking of, maybe the language with which you're most comfortable writing. And if it happens to be Kikuyu, and there were others too, those Mulina Wavosi, which was written in Abaluya, those Ramogi, which was written in Doluo. So they all tended to be written in vernacular, but that limited the audience that could read it beyond that ethnic group. So whether or not you're going to be coming to a point where you can talk about them as being nation builders is questionable. On the other hand, we have scholars like John Lonsdale and Bruce Berman who have studied the effect of print on the formation of ethnic identities. And we actually can see how newspapers fit into that equation of, calcifying what are fairly recent socio-cultural phenomena and making them take these shapes of ethnic groups as the 21st century proceeds,
So is there a reading public which emerges, at least within these ethnic language journals, newspapers, that there's at least a reading public which emerges as a product of their production?
Well, certainly, a lot of times the people who they're speaking to people like themselves. So if a newspaper is being written by young mission-educated male, he's writing for other young mission educated males like himself. It's a really delicate issue because we also have to remember that literacy rates were not what they are today. So there are very few people who could read in any language, and so that again places a certain limit. At the same time, it doesn't mean that the contents of the newspaper will be limited to literate people, because we have to remember that these are cultures that were oral cultures. The spoken word was the order of the day before, Europeans get there. So the contents of a newspaper would travel beyond the literate circles. So the reading public tended to be the reading public itself that's actually reading will be people like themselves, but the ideas would spread. At the same time, there were, there are certain people who are obviously missing. I think I'm particularly struck by the absence of women, women and gender being another of my interests, the absence of women from the newspaper sector, not just Africans, but Asians and Europeans too. Men are the editors, they're the journalists, they're the largest number of correspondents to the newspaper. So there's something missing there as well.
On that point, and we'll end with this question, that how do you foresee a research project for yourself and in terms of studying African women in history? How does one go about doing it if they're not available in print resources and in evidence?
Well, fortunately, there are lots of people who've gone before me, and the field of African women's history definitely took off around the same time as women's history as far as Europe and America is concerned. And there's quite a bit of research that has been done. A lot of times, precisely because they're absent from text or the archives, there might be a very heavy oral history component to writing their history. And, then this is the post-colonial world, people reading and interrogating silences of all kinds. So the research is there, and I think I'm encouraged by the amount that has been done, and hopefully more will be done.
Thank you so much for your time today, Professor Phoebe. And we've really honed in, as it were, we had another session on African studies earlier, which was rather broad, brushstrokes in general, but we honed in on a particular question within African history in this conversation, and we're glad we did that because we got a glimpse of, as it were, how to approach the question of African history from the minutiae of detail and evidence which is available to us. Thank you for your time, and we wish our listeners Ramadan Kareem, Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to also wish our listeners who are fasting at this time.
Yes, certainly. Ramadan Kareem.
Thank you so much for your time today, and we hope that our listeners will stay tuned to our next episode. A special thanks to Ehab Al Sheikh for bringing this program to you. And until then, goodbye.